Welcome back everyone, it is Mike from ManaHoarders. I am bringing you our first Commander gameplay video of this channel. It's been a goal of mine for quite a long time to bring you guys some Commander gameplay videos, so I'm very excited to finally bring you this one here. I will admit the video is a bit rough around the edges, but I hope with a little bit more practice I can bring you guys even higher quality content moving forward. And now without further delay, we have Dustin running Yoriko, Tiger's Shadow. I am running Veyran, Voice of Duality. We have Nick and his commander Zangief, the Red Cyclone. And we have Damian running Tovolar, Dire Overlord. I hope you all enjoy. And so turn 1 begins. Nick wins the die roll. He draws for turn before playing a basic forest and passing it over to Damian. Damian draws his card for turn before also playing a forest and passing it over to Dustin. Moving to Dustin's turn 1, he draws for turn, plays a basic swamp, taps it for 1 mana to cast Amulet of Vigor before passing the turn over to me. For my turn 1, I draw for turn, play a command tower, and pass to Nick. For the beginning of turn 2, Nick draws for turn, plays a basic swamp, and then taps it to cast Infiltration Lens before passing it to Damian. Here we see Damian draw for turn, and then plays a basic mountain before passing it over to Dustin. Dustin draws for turn and plays a Secluded Courtyard as his land for turn. He taps 2 and casts Demonic Tutor before passing the turn to me. I draw for turn and play a mountain before passing to Nick. Nick draws for turn and plays a mountain. He then taps 3 mana to cast Fierce Empath. This allows him to search for a creature card with converted mana cost 6 or greater. After searching, he reveals the Tarask, putting it into his hand and then passing the turn. Damian draws for turn and plays a basic forest. He then taps out all 3 of his mana to cast his commander Tovolar, Dire Overlord, from his command zone before passing it over to Dustin. Dustin draws for turn. For his land, he plays Shizu, Death's Storehouse. He then taps 2 to cast Nether Trader. Nether Trader has haste, so it is able to attack the same turn it enters the battlefield. And being the nice guy he is, Dustin just can't decide who to attack, so he leaves it up to a die roll. And as fate would have it, Nick is the one getting attacked by Nether Trader. After claiming first blood and dealing 1 damage to Nick, Dustin passes the turn. I draw for turn and play a basic mountain. I then tap all 3 of my mana to cast Veyran, Voice of Duality with much excitement, before passing the turn to Nick. Nick draws for turn and plays a basic forest. He taps 3 of his mana to play the equipment Kusarigama. He gives us a nice little explanation of what it does and then passes the turn to Damian. Damian will draw for turn before playing a basic mountain. He taps 3 mana to cast the Celestus. This allows him to manipulate the day and night cycle, which is perfect for his werewolves. He then passes the turn to Dustin. For the beginning of Dustin's turn, he draws and plays an Academy Ruins. He then taps the Academy Ruins to cast a Soul Ring. He taps the Soul Ring and 2 more lands to cast Empowered Auto-Generator. This enters the battlefield tapped, but because of his Amulet of Vigor, it untaps. Moving to combat, he leaves the decision up to the Dice Gods, who choose me to get attacked by Nether Trader. I am unable to block Nether Trader, so Dustin taps a blue and a black to ninjutsu Yoriko from his command zone. I take the 1 damage and he flips the top card of his library. He flips a land so none of us take any damage from her ability, and then he passes the turn. I draw for turn and play a Temple of Epiphany as my land for turn. It enters the battlefield tapped. I scry from its ability and decide to leave the card on top. I then pay 3 mana to cast Wind Rider Wizard. I then move to combat and crack back at Dustin with Veyran for 2 damage before passing the turn to Nick. We see Nick untap and draw before playing a basic swamp for turn. He then taps all 5 of his mana to cast a Zangief and then passes the turn to Damian. We see Damian draw for turn, but he does not have a land drop to play. He does pay 3 mana to cast Cultivate, and while searching for his lands, he decides to go ahead and pass the turn to Dustin. We see Dustin draw for turn. He taps his Academy Ruins, and he taps Empowered Auto Generator for 2 blue mana to transmute Muddle the Mixture. He then searches his library and reveals Cover of Darkness. He puts it into his hand and plays a Mutavault as his land for turn. He then taps 2 mana. Then he is unsure if he wants to tap that 2 mana. Then he taps it again. Then he taps an additional swamp and casts Cover of Darkness, choosing Ninja. Then he realizes that he is unable to cast Nether Trader as he is out of black mana. With his 1 mana floating, he reminds us that he chose Ninja for his Cover of Darkness. He then decides to swing Yoriko at Damien for 1 damage. Yoriko deals combat damage to Damien, so Dustin flips the top card of his library, and it's a swamp, so none of us take any damage. He then passes the turn. I draw for turn, and unfortunately miss a land drop. I tap a command tower for a blue and a mountain for a red to cast Goblin Electromancer. I move to combat and begin having flashbacks of the many games we have lost at the hands of Yoriko, and then I swing at Dustin for 2 damage from my commander before passing the turn over to Nick. Nick untaps and draws and plays a Kessig Wolf Run as his land for turn. He taps his swamp for 1 and equips Zangief with Infiltration Lens. He then taps 3 more mana and equips Zangief with the Kusarigama. Moving to combat, Nick decides to leave the decision to the Dice Gods, and they decide that I'm the one to be attacked by Zangief. In response, I pay a blue to cast Resculpt, targeting Zangief, so he is exiled. We do forget to give Nick the 4/4 red and blue elemental creature token. Casting this instant in sorcery does trigger my Windrider Wizard, but because Veyran is on the battlefield, it actually triggers twice. After losing Zangief, Nick decides to pass the turn to Damien. Damien untaps for turn. He plays a basic mountain. He then taps 5 mana and plays Vanquisher's Banner, choosing Werewolves. This will give all of his werewolves +1/+1. He then moves to combat and swings his commander at Dustin. Damien draws from Tovolar's attack trigger, Dustin takes the 4 damage, and Damien passes the turn. Dustin draws for turn and misses his land drop. He goes ahead and pays 1 mana and makes Mutavault a creature with all creature types, so it is technically a ninja. Moving to combat, he will swing Mutavault at Damien and chooses to swing Yoriko at me. He will not ninjutsu any creature, so Damien takes the 2 and I take 1. He flips 2 cards from Yoriko's triggers. The first is an island, the second is a Walker of the Secret Ways, so we each take 3 damage. In his second main phase, he plays the island that he flipped off of Yoriko's trigger. He pays 2 black to get Nether Trader back out onto the battlefield. He then taps Soul Ring for 2 colorless mana, casts Umezawa's Hite, and passes the turn. I untap and draw for turn, and unfortunately miss yet another land drop. I tap Temple of Epiphany for a blue and cast Slip Through Space, targeting Veyran. This will give me 2 triggers from Windrider Wizard, so I will be able to draw and then discard twice, and I also get to draw a card from the Slip Through Space. At this point, I'm getting so desperate for instants and sorceries, I am pretty much discarding anything that is not one of those. I go ahead and tap 2 and put out an Arcane Signet. I tap the Signet for a red and cast Midgame Mortars, targeting Nether Trader. In response, Dustin casts Evacuation, returning all creatures to their owner's hands. I go ahead and draw and then discard twice from my Windrider Wizard trigger, and then all creatures go to their hands before I pass the turn. Nick draws for turn, and then plays a basic swamp. He taps all of his mana to recast Zangief, and then passes the turn over to Damien. He draws for turn, and then plays a basic mountain. He then taps 3, and then recasts Tovolar from his hand. He taps another 3 to cast Hermit of the Natternolls before passing the turn to Dustin. Dustin untaps and draws for turn. He pays 1 and makes Mutavault a creature. He then taps 2 swamps to cast Nether Trader. Moving to combat, he sends Mutavault at me and Nether Trader at Damien. Neither one of us is able to block, so he ninjutsus out Nether Trader to bring Yoriko back into the battlefield. Damage is dealt, and he gets 2 flips from his Yoriko triggers. He flips Ingenious Infiltrator and Dakuchi Silencer, dealing a total of 6 damage to each of his opponents. In his second main phase, he taps the Empowered Auto Generator for 4 mana and taps the Sol Ring for 2 to put out Caged Sun, naming black as the color for it. He then plays a swamp as his land for turn. He taps it and it generates 2 mana, and with that 2 mana he puts down Dakuchi Silencer. He reminds us that since Yoriko entered the battlefield tapped, she untaps due to Amulet of Vigor. Then, with nothing else to do, he passes the turn. I draw for turn and play an island. I pay 3 mana to recast Wind Rider Wizard. I then pay an additional 3 to recast my commander. This does trigger my Wind Rider Wizard, so I get to draw a card and then discard, choosing to discard Goblin Electromancer before passing the turn. Nick untaps and draws for turn. He then pays 6 mana to cast the Haunt of Hightower. He then pays 1 mana and equips Infiltration Lens to Zangief. As Nick moves to combat, the Dice Gods decide that Dustin will be Zangief's next victim. Dustin blocks with Yoriko, and at this point we actually look over Zangief's ability one more time, and then once Yoriko dies to Zangief via combat damage, he sacrifices his Umezawa's Hite to Zangief's ability. In his second main phase, he plays a Forest, and he remembers that the Haunt of Hightower should have gotten a 1/1 counter because a card entered an opponent's graveyard. He then passes the turn to Damien. Damien starts his turn by playing a Ruptured Spire. He then taps 3 and plays Icon of Ancestry, choosing Werewolves. He taps another 3, playing Daybreak Ranger before passing the turn to Dustin. Dustin untaps and draws his card for turn before playing a basic swamp. He taps that swamp for 2 black and casts Nether Trader. He taps his Academy Ruins to make Mutavault a creature. He then pays 3 to hardcast Yoriko from his command zone. Moving to combat, Dustin sends Dakuchi Silencer at Nick. Nether Trader at Damien, and he attacks me with Mutavault. Since Nether Trader is an unblocked attacker, he ninjutsus it out for Ingenious Infiltrator. After combat damage is dealt, Dakuchi Silencer is sent to the graveyard due to Nick blocking with the Haunt of Hightower. Ingenious Infiltrator untaps due to Amulet of Vigor, and then Dustin draws 2 cards and then flips 2 cards off of the Ingenious Infiltrator triggers and from the Yoriko triggers. Fortunately for the rest of the table, he flips 2 lands and we take no more damage. In his second main phase, he taps a swamp for 2 black mana to recast his Nether Trader. He taps his Empowered Auto Generator for 5 blue mana and taps his Sol Ring. He uses one of the blue mana to put down Thousand Faced Shadow. He follows that up by casting Sakashima the Imposter, making it a copy of Nick's Haunt of Hightower. And with that, Dustin ends his turn. I untap and then draw. I tap 4 and cast Stormkiln Artist before passing the turn. Nick untaps, draws, and then he pays 5 mana to put Gift of Doom onto Zangief. He pays 3 mana to recast Fierce Empath, allowing him to tutor for a creature with CMC 6 or greater. He reveals Vigor and puts it into his hand. Moving to combat, Nick rolls for it. And Dustin is the one getting attacked by Zangief. Dustin blocks with Nether Trader and then ends up sacrificing his Soul Ring to Zangief's ability before Nick passes the turn. At the start of Damien's turn, it becomes night. To start things off, he taps 4 and casts Instigator Gang. He then pays 3 and casts Silver Fur Partisan. He remembers his Vanquisher's Banner trigger and draws a card. Damien then casts Destructive Revelry, destroying the Gift of Doom that is on Zangief, and passes the turn. Dustin begins his turn and moves straight to combat, swinging Yoriko, Ingenious Infiltrator, and Thousand Face Shadow at me. He taps his Empowered Auto Generator for 5 blue mana and taps a Swamp for 2. To ninjutsu out the Thousand Face Shadow for Walker of the Secret Ways. He then ninjutsus the Thousand Face Shadow back in, swapping it with the Walker of the Secret Ways, creating a token of the Ingenious Infiltrator from the Thousand Face Shadow trigger. He then completes this loop one more time to give him 3 total Ingenious Infiltrators. Moving to damage, I take the 8 combat damage, but Dustin does remind me that since some of these creatures are black, I take the additional because of Caged Sun. The dust settles, and then all of the Ingenious Infiltrator triggers go off, each one triggering 5 times, meaning Dustin gets to draw 15 cards. He does that first, drawing all 15. Then he does the 5 flips off of the Yoriko triggers. Fortunately for us, the first 2 flips were only lands, and the next 3 amounted to 7 total damage for each of us. In his second main phase, Dustin plays a Reliquary Tower, which was in the mountain of cards he just drew, then he pays 2 mana and puts down Imperial Plate. He moves forward and equips the Imperial Plate to his Sakashima the Imposter, which is again a copy of Nick's Haunt of Hightower. He finishes up by tapping 3 and putting down Kefnet the Mindful, and after solidifying himself as the arch enemy, passes to me. I begin my turn by tapping 3 and putting down Saheeli Sublime Artificer. I downtick her and use her ability to make Arcane Signet a copy of Stormkiln Artist. I then cast Dive Down, targeting my commander. I forget to create my 2 servos from the Saheeli triggers, but I do pump up my commander, create 4 treasures, and I get to draw and discard twice. I then use 2 of the treasures to cast Firebrand Archer. With that, I use the 2 remaining treasures, and I tap my final 2 lands to cast Mizzix's Mastery. This makes me some treasures, some servos, lets me draw and discard, deals 2 damage to each of my opponents from the Fireband triggers, and it pumps up Veyran that much more. Once all of the cast triggers resolve, I let the Mizzix's Mastery target my Slip Through Space from my graveyard, allowing me to cast it for free. I go through all of the cast triggers once again, and then using Slip Through Space, I target my commander, making Veyran unblockable and drawing a card. I play my mountain for turn, and then I sack 3 of the treasures to play Gutter Snipe. After a fairly explosive turn, I realized I had run out of gas. So I at least swing at Dustin with my unblockable commander for a nice chunk of damage, and I pass it over to Nick. Nick pays 3 mana and puts down Eternal Witness, getting Gift of Doom back from his graveyard to his hand. He then pays 5 mana and once again casts the Gift of Doom, targeting Zangief. Moving to combat, Nick swings Zangief at me, I block with a servo and sacrifice a treasure to Zangief's ability, and Nick draws 2 off of the Infiltration Lens. Following combat, Nick passes the turn. He draws for turn and then plays a basic mountain as his land for turn. In an effort to get something back from his graveyard to deal with the Cover of Darkness, Damien taps 5 and casts Creeping Renaissance, choosing Instants. But after rereading the card, he realizes that he must choose a permanent type, of which Instants are not. So this is a misplay, and Creeping Renaissance goes to the graveyard, much to Dustin's delight. As we move to combat, I realize I am about to be a punching bag for Yoriko and her group of ninjas, so I urge Damien to attack me so that he can draw some cards from his werewolves and potentially find an answer to give him and Nick a fighting chance. Damien declares his 3 attackers, which are more than enough to kill me, and I choose not to block any of them, denying Dustin the triple kill, because I hate ninjas, and allowing Damien to draw 3 cards. After drawing his 3 cards, he does in fact find something that can help him out. He pays 3 mana and casts Bala Ged Recovery. He then targets the Destructive Revelry from his graveyard and puts it back into his hand. Having finally found the piece to deal with that Cover of Darkness, he goes to cast it, but realizes he is out of green mana, which he desperately needs, and then finding out that he can cast nothing else, he passes the turn to Dustin. Dustin begins his turn by untapping and drawing. The first thing he does is make Mutavault a creature, and then he pays 2 mana to put down Scroll Rack. Getting right down to it, Dustin swings his entire board at Damien except for the Haunt of Hightower, which he swings at Nick. Nick blocks with his own Haunt of Hightower, and since they each have lifelink, Nick and Dustin go ahead and gain their life from the combat damage. Nick gains 17 life, and since Dustin has his Haunt of Hightower equipped with Imperial Plate, and he has close to 30 cards in his hand, he gains a large chunk of life as well. Damien dies to the combat damage, and Dustin begins drawing cards from all of his ingenious Infiltrator triggers. At this point, the camera battery died, so after a brief charge, we start filming again once Dustin has drawn all of his cards and he begins his flips from his Yoriko triggers. His first flip is Shadow of Mortality, dealing 15 damage to Nick. He then flips Aether Spouts for another 5 damage. With his Yoriko triggers still on the stack, he activates his Scroll Rack. This allows him to put any cards from his hand back on top of his library in any order, so he chooses to put the Shadow of Mortality and Aether Spouts back on top. And just like that, Dustin flips 2 more cards, revealing Shadow of Mortality and Aether Spouts once again, dealing lethal damage to Nick and winning the game. And just like that, Dustin and Yoriko take the win. If you enjoyed this video, be sure to hit that like button, subscribe, tell your friends about us, and leave a comment down below. Let us know if you would like to see some more Commander gameplay videos in the future. I really appreciate all of your support.